That should be good, yeah?
Should be good.
I think we're good. Okay, in that case, do you want to introduce us quickly, and then I'll introduce the author, and then you can introduce the book, and then we can get going.
Yeah, okay. Hi and welcome to one of our book discussions. We try to upload them every 2 weeks, where we take a book, we read it, we interpret it, we analyze it, and we hope that we can provide some useful interpretation for you out there. This is Aryn.
Hey.
I'm Nick, and let's get started. This week we have Brave New World.
So Brave New World is by Aldous Huxley. He was born in 1894 in Surrey. He died in 1963. He wrote a foreword to this book in 1946, so that will be quite important later, I think. He was quite a prolific writer, but in Brave New World is definitely his seminal book, I would say. He did later on produce Doors to Perception, which is actually a really good one to follow up on a book like this. I would indicate that in his later writing, he became more inspired by mysticism and certainly more experimentation with areas of mysticism attached to drug use, sort of. He was very inspirational and certainly culturally relevant for the countercultural movement that would have happened in sort of the early 60s. So keep that in mind when reading this book, I would say.
Definitely. Yeah, to summarize the contents very roughly, Brave New World is about a dystopian vision Huxley laid out for the future of humanity, where human beings live in somewhat perfect societies. They are, well, at least we could say that they are all bred together. They are made for different positions in the society, and everybody has their place. They consume constantly either drugs or sex or television or music. There is not really a break to think for any of them, but they're constantly busy and happy. And to be unhappy is sort of seen as a little bit of a weird anomaly. How do you say it?
An anomaly.
Anomaly.
Yeah. Something like that.
At some point. And why wouldn't you be happy in a perfect society? I mean, everything works, we have the utopian place of beauty.
Brought up a lot in the book, actually, this idea of being happy and unhappy. Yeah.
Well, so the protagonist of the first part of the book is actually Bernard.
Bernard Marx.
Bernard is his name.
By the way, I absolutely love the names in this. Yeah. Benita Hoover's my favorite, by the way, but we'll get to that later.
To the names. But Bernard Marx, who people sort of think he had some kind of stuff put in his drink when he was a baby, because he's a little bit weird. He's always a little bit sad. He's smaller than the other people of his class, and he's a little bit of an outsider. And very roughly, to summarize, Bernard is unhappy with the society, finds a girl, is not really happy with the girl because all she wants is interchangeable sex and is not really interested in any deep, lasting relationship because everybody is everybody else's property, as it gets repeated constantly. And so they go into a reservation where people still live in the old ways,
which was savage reservation, as it's called. Yeah,
the savage reservation. And they pick up somebody from there whose mother was originally born in this new world, in this perfect utopia, but then was forced to migrate into the reserve. And she has a son, and they take the son back, and he gets introduced to the society and is seen as a big gimmick, basically. Like, oh, look at him, coming from normal people, and now he's like a corrupted poor soul.
This sort of sideshow almost.
Yeah. And so you go through him, and he basically critiques the society that is built up as this perfect place, and that's roughly the story. I don't think we need to go into that much more detail.
I think that pretty much summarizes it accurately. If I may, can I lead out immediately with an interesting question?
Yes, please.
Because the book is essentially focusing on the caste system. It presents that as one of the main themes throughout. In terms of our contemporary society, when Huxley wrote this, he wrote it in, I think, 1933?
32.
32.
Yeah.
which is really important historically. If you think about it, Nazism, Hitler hadn't necessarily risen to power yet. He was about to. 1 year later, he does, in 1933. So that's a really important year. But if we now transport Brave New World into our contemporary society, do you think it holds up, this idea of the epsilon, the alpha? Are we the alphas? Who's the epsilon?
Oh.
So, diving off into the deep end straight away. What do you make of it? Do we still have this caste system, but perhaps not in such a dramatic way as represented in the book, but to a certain extent, are we still living under a sort of a perpetual caste system? Are there alphas? Are there epsilons? Are there gammas? Are we happy in our positions?
Well, it's an interesting point to start out with. I would say definitely not explicitly, like nobody writes on their, Twitter or LinkedIn profile, epsilon, producing content.
Could be interesting.
Nevertheless, the social hierarchy is still there. I mean, it was always there, and you have people who are in higher positions, you have people sort of a little bit lower, hanging on to the end. So this idea definitely holds up. It doesn't hold up explicitly. I mean,
no,
we don't like to talk about it, and we try to flatten all of these kind of steep hierarchical structures nowadays as much as possible. But I would say they still exist. And I would say that there is some form of elitism that exists nowadays as well. If you look at the ideas produced in Silicon Valley, where they stand in the world, how they interact with the world.
Oh, absolutely. If we're talking about political polarization and things like that, absolutely. I think, obviously Huxley would have got inspiration from the Hindu caste system for this, because there's definitely elements of that. For example, the controller is allowed to read banned books. So, whereas others are not. Others are not allowed to have access to corruptible material, essentially, is the way the book frames it. But this is very similar to the way that sort of religious texts, for example, like if we use the Hindu caste system, only Brahmins are able to read the text. And if we go to sort of sort of Gutenberg, only priests were allowed to read the Bible, and so there's this hierarchy of who gets access to information. I don't necessarily think we live in such a structured hierarchical system like that anymore, but I think we certainly have elements of that still impose upon us.
So something I wanted to talk with you about actually is undoubtedly I didn't even think about the caste system from Hinduism so much when I read it. I thought mainly about the Soviet Union. Oh,
I would agree with you, actually, because he's definitely getting inspiration. I mean, okay, that's a really good...
Maybe you can dive into that a little bit. What do you think about that?
That's a really good question. I would actually follow up with a question on top of your question. What political system is Brave New World? Is it communism? And I have a real problem with it if we are going to say it is communist, because it's... If I may just lead a little bit, communism would be the idea we've completely flattened the curve, essentially. There's no real you don't have a social identity in a sense. But within this world, social identity is so important, but it's almost negated in a sense, because it's like, it's important, but you shouldn't, you're happy to be an epsilon if you're an epsilon. You're happy to be a gamma. You're happy to be an alpha. You don't think about being unhappy in your position. So in that sense, the caste system is completely unimportant because nobody's considering it in that way. But in another sense, it's the very foundation of the society.
No, I would agree with you. To straight out say that this society is formed after the ideals outlined by Marx and Engels. I would disagree with that as well. I don't think it is. However, if you look at the practicality of how communism was lived, let's say in the Soviet Union and in other parts of the world, and how it was implemented, you still had a stratified hierarchical structure.
Oh, absolutely.
So you still have that nowadays in China. You have the Communist Party and nothing but the Communist Party. And
it's a sort of, if you go back in history to Mao China, for example, this is a very hierarchical system.
Yes.
Well, it's only flattened at the bottom.
Exactly.
it's a pyramid.
So everybody has nothing at the bottom. And that is, But I would say it's somewhat of a, I don't know how far you would agree with me on this. I would say it's somewhat of an unholy union between capitalism and socialism. So
I love that. That's so good.
Everything is, so one main part of this book that Huxley, I think, tries to transport is that we as human beings have this propensity to consume.
Yeah.
Right? We want to get fed input all the time. We don't want, so I don't know how many can relate to just sitting in their bed and watching YouTube or Instagram instead of doing something else, something that might challenge them a little bit.
Yeah.
But we just have this propensity as a species to just want content all the time. Yep. And that is definitely in there. And that's a capitalist trait. But on the other hand, you have the social organism, and you have the greater good, and you have the social body, and you have, you know, what would you say to that?
I absolutely agree. I love the sort of the comparative between a socialistic structure and a capitalist one in this sense. It's very interesting because, like I said, they're trying to flatten the curve, but it's very much hierarchical and totalitarian in a sense, because it's telling you what to like, what not to like. So in a sense, people might critique the book and saying, oh, these epsilons, we wouldn't need epsilons because we could have robots or something to do all this work. But in many ways, that's sort of undermining what the narrative is. It's got nothing to do with that. It's got to do with consumption. Mm-hmm. It doesn't, they reject the idea of progress. They don't want progress. They only want maximum consumption, the maximization of utilitarian ideas. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, as long as everybody's happy, that's all that matters. So in a socialistic structure, of course, the idea is we'd all be equals. They're not all equals at all in this society, but they are equally happy. That, I think, is the theme that's trying to be presented.
Absolutely.
It's not about this division of power. It's about a division of happiness.
Absolutely. And there is a moment in the book when Bernard and his, I think Lenina is her name, his acquaintance that he fancies, they fly over this graveyard, where bodies are burned.
Yeah.
And she looks at it and she has this moment of sadness where she instantly then takes a drug because
the
obviously
soma,
sadness
we'll get onto that in a bit.
So sadness is unbearable. But she quickly thinks, well, I'm sure glad that I'm not an epsilon, that I'm an alpha or beta, whatever she is. But they are as useful as we are for this society. And they are as important as we are. And that is an idea that is not socialist in its essence, but it has socialist tendencies.
Absolutely.
There was also something in the Middle Ages, in Europe with the peasantry, which was the largest body of the medieval European society, 95-98% or something. And it was always pushed that even though there is this hierarchy and the peasants are at the bottom, they are also at the top because they are important to keep the whole system going. So there is this equality, even though unequal, shared in happiness, as you said it.
So an interesting way would be looking at, obviously, they're indoctrinated. This is heavily conditioned. The people of Brave New World, this isn't a matter of, I'm an epsilon and I'm happy. They're conditioned to be happy from birth. I mean, it's one of the themes, this idea of sleep.
Hypnopedia.
Hypnopedia, really interesting name. I mean, kind of comes to think of Hypnos Morpheus type thinking. But in a sense, without that conditioning, would they be happy? Now, the moment an epsilon would recognize, and I'm hypothesizing here, of course, but the moment an epsilon would recognize that it is an epsilon, that it, in other words, it would potentially be happier if it were an alpha.
But it isn't.
Yeah, it never thinks like that. It's never actually allowed to.
It is.
It's both preconditioned from birth and then postconditioned through the drug soma. Which is very interesting because there's two types of conditioning going on there.
So there's something I wanted to talk with you about, and specifically, because obviously this book is heavily influenced by the conditioning, by the behavioral literature at the time, that you can make people do whatever you want if you program them in the right way. So human beings as blank slates that you can imprint your wishes upon. There is this notion in this book, as well as in science, that we can understand human nature.
So are you talking more like behavioral science and the study of behaviorism?
Yes.
Yeah.
So that we can determine what somebody will do by feeding them the right inputs. Now, you're a philosopher.
I mean, that's
at
such
heart.
a huge question.
But I wanted to bring it.
Yeah.
It's like you're a philosopher at heart. What do you think that is something that science aims for, or that it should aim for, or that it can do to determine everything that human beings are?
Yeah, I'm going to bite and give it a go. I will say it's a huge question. I think at heart science needs to. Science is about discovery, fundamentally. Discovering the world around us, discovering the nature of reality, the nature of a human being, the nature of, well, everything, really. Because if science is going to lead out with that, very interesting if we were to juxtapose the idea of our idea of science and Brave New World's idea of science. We can do that in a bit, actually. But in a sense, it has to then look at behaviorism. It has to try and understand why we do things. And if there is a root cause to why we are doing things. I don't believe it'll ever get there, because I believe it's just too complex. It's too complex. So it's not a simple thing. You can't just sort of do a methodological reduction and say, this person behaves in this way because of A. I don't necessarily think we'll ever get to that point, but I do think we can make inferences to say this person most likely behaves in this way because of X, Y, and Z. It won't just be a simple answer. It'll be a one that is quite complicated. Should it be doing that? In many ways, sort of the scientific investigation of behavior takes away a little bit of the ontological identity of ourselves. It's sort of saying we can reduce this to an equation.
Yes.
Which sort of reduces the humanity in many ways.
Which I think is a notion that in the book is very prevalent.
Yeah.
Because the human being is treated as part of something bigger.
Well, part of a cog. It's completely reduced.
It's a machine in the social system, and you can tune it and you can turn it. And I mean,
I think there's a little bit more of a deeper narrative as well within the book, because it's not just the idea that you can tune it. It's their idea that they've recognized they've got to a certain point in tuning it, that they don't want to discover anything else. They found the happy equilibrium.
Yes.
And that's the point where they stop.
Yes.
If you were a true scientist, you would never stop at the happy equilibrium.
Yes.
You would push it further. You would go beyond. You would try and discover and understand. You plumb the depths of the psychology and the behavior, as it were. They're not doing that. No. They've reached a point, and that's as far as they're going to go. I mean, in the book itself, they describe some interesting experiments. So the Alpha Island, for example, where they got a bunch of alphas together and said, right, run the world yourself, and it was a complete disaster. Yeah. So they recognize to maintain the equilibrium, they had to lose their science, which is fascinating.
There is this moment in the book where the world controller, so the person that is in charge of the specific island, we actually talked about it right before we started recording it, where he reads this brilliant new approach to biology as a discipline. He reads, oh my God, this is a fascinating, innovative, beautiful paper. Don't publish it. Don't publish it, because it will get people thinking on wrong ways.
Yep.
And for us, I think this will be an interesting point for us. Huxley chooses as the problem of this paper that it could instill the thought that human beings don't strive for happiness. They strive for a furthering of their consciousness.
Yes. Oh God, that's such a key point.
Now, when I read that, it resonated very deeply with me. Can you maybe elaborate on what you think he means by that? Furthering of consciousness.
So I think it's important to recognize where Huxley goes later on in life, because he later gets heavily involved in sort of mysticism and sort of thinking of altered conscious states specifically. If we conceptually think of this like enlightenment, for example. So we obviously, within science, we recognize the Enlightenment period where suddenly humanity sort of breaks away from sort of religious structure and, this very structured way of thinking, this very particular way of thinking, to suddenly take on new ideas. sort of going into consciousness, that's sort of the final horizon, if you like, because there are some science that will debunk the idea of consciousness. They're very, very keen on this idea of, no, it needs to be structurally peeled back to the biological, level. But if you're going to sort of plumb the depths of consciousness, in many ways, you can't possibly do it in such a structured society that was presented in Brave New World. That is the killer of consciousness, because the moment you're probing free thought, you're, in a sense, you're questioning your own identity. You're not allowed to question your own identity in a Brave New World. So you're only allowed to be part, community. That's one of the big things. If you're going to do a self-analysis on consciousness and try and expand that way of thinking, you couldn't possibly do it in this environment that Huxley's presenting.
So consciousness, in the sense that he means it and that I understand it very roughly, is like an awareness of one's own self and of the surrounding, and like going through a process which is characterized by uncomfort, disequilibrium, and then broadening one's horizon. Reading a new book is not in itself pleasant, but so it can be pleasant if it's a nice book. If you read a difficult book, it's actually very exhausting.
It's Kant, for example.
You learn something through it, and you get a little bit wise, and you enhance your knowledge about it. And so this process of struggle, I find it so interesting because it resonates very deeply with me, that he identifies this specific dangerous paper with the goal of human purpose, the thing that humans strive for, but this specific society that is centered on happiness doesn't allow. It can't allow human beings to become more aware of themselves and of their surroundings. It needs unconscious robots that are in their happy state where they don't need to do anything and they just get fed constantly. And now, I don't know what you think, but I think we can take a lot from that and translate it into modern society. So, a lot.
I would just say, the interesting anecdotal story, actually, not my anecdote, but it's Karl Marx. I seldom agree with Karl Marx, but...
let's give him a go.
But I believe it was either at Broadstairs or Margate. So it's one of those two beaches, because he used to holiday there a lot, apparently. And a person went up to him and went, Karl, what's the meaning of life? When you break it all down, what does it all come down to? And his famous words were struggle. And in many ways, to struggle. In many ways, he's right. Another poet once actually said, a person's character is determined by how many scars they have. So metaphorically speaking, their background. So you can't really... The history within Brave New World is unimportant. It doesn't matter. It's the right here and now. Even the future's unimportant. It's all about here and now. But we are where we are now. Whether it's our individual character or our science or our discovery, because of struggle. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't because of that.
And I think you can make a very informed case. Like, obviously we're speaking as like non-experts, but I think you can make a very, very informed case that human beings are actually constituted for struggle.
Yeah,
we're not made for paradise.
No.
I
mean, that's a really good point, actually. And
I mean, because I don't read Brave New World as a dystopia.
No, neither do I.
I read it as a perfect world, as a utopia realized, and all the problems that come along with the perfect
I'm not sure I
world.
agree that it's a utopia realized, but I'll get to that. Because in many ways, when you read the book, you almost want to feel pessimistic about the utopia in a sense, to sort of say, oh, it's a bad thing that's happening, and John Savage is, the voice of reason in this. I'm not sure he is, but when the controller is sort of describing to John in the book itself, Mr. Savage, as he calls him, why society is like it is, when I read it, I almost get a sense of agreement with the controller in many ways. I can recognize his rationale behind it.
Yep.
to sort of say, yeah, actually, if you do want to maximize happiness, you really do have to flatten the curve.
You do.
Otherwise, you are going to have variability. And when you have variation, which is, as some people like to say, it's the stuff of life, you can't be happy all the time. Not only will you become disenchanted with the happiness, potentially, which is another reason why I believe Soma is very necessary in this book, because it's a way of creating that secondary conditioning. Because the happiness itself, it's a bit like you eat a piece of cake. I love cake, but if you were just to eat cake 24/7, you're going to get sick of cake really quickly. So to balance that within this sort of, I'm going to create an oxymoron here. I call it a utopian dystopia, is what he's presenting.
So he's presenting utopia and he shows all the flaws of it.
Yeah.
And that is why it's, I think, such a great piece of work. It is absolutely fascinating to me because he analyzes the book among so many levels. So one of the other reasons why I read communism and the Soviet Union in this book is because there is a very heavy emphasis on the individual just not really existing, but being part of the social body.
Yes.
And it's something that communism shares with National Socialism. By the way.
Absolutely,
So this is across
it's just two extremes, depending on which way you go with it.
The political spectrum. The individual is how would you say, desanctified? So it's not taken as the unit that needs to be catered to.
It's demystified in many ways. Yeah.
What needs to be catered to is the social body.
Yes.
And the individual has to serve the social body.
Absolutely. You know, Emil Durkheim had a fabulous saying. He basically said, ideas that are assented to as a society become sacrosanct. And that's what we see within the book itself, because they demystify God within the book. Society is God. For Brave New World, very much so.
The Ford.
Exactly.
Ford. So the place they live is called Ford.
The T sign, of course.
There's a lot of Easter eggs of the time there. Like
absolutely.
Henry Ford, obviously, with the industrial production. And
so I would like to lead out a little bit, actually, because Huxley wrote a foreword for the book. I think I mentioned before we even began this discussion that I wanted to speak about the foreword, because in many ways the foreword gives us an insight in what Huxley thought later on in life. The foreword was written in 1946.
The Brave New World Revisited, or
in a sense, but he chose not to rewrite the book, which I find interesting. He chose to keep it in its current form, but he critiques his own book, which I think is a bit unusual to present it at the start of the book, by the way. But there's a particular theme I want to pick up on. He brings the idea that the savage only has two choices: utopia or savageness. And Huxley said that was a mistake. He believed there was a third option, which was sort of the idea of Iceland, the free countries, essentially. And on reading Huxley in that way, I've kind of reminded of Zizek, so Slavoj Zizek, who gave the idea within the Matrix, it's the blue pill or the red pill, right? And Zizek goes, no, he wants the third pill option. And this is essentially what Huxley's doing, saying there should be a third option.
Yeah.
I disagree with it. I actually think there are only two options. And I'm just going to give you an opportunity to see if you can discuss it before I give you my my thoughts on it. Are there more than one option within this? If you imagine two societal structures set up, this utopian society and this sort of savage society, is there a middle ground?
Well, of course there is.
Okay, I'm glad we disagree, because this is really fascinating.
So I would say that in some sense, even though we always tend towards the utopianism and the savagery, we are living in a sort of middle ground. The thing that I would say that is absolutely vital and that is not given in the savagery as outlined in the book and in the social structure is the sanctity of the individual.
Okay, so liberty in a sense. Are we talking
liberty,
that line?
Exactly. So that the individual is free to roam as it wants and contribute to the social body as it wants, and not contribute to the social body as it wants.
So I would agree on an individual level, but where I'm going to detract a little bit is I definitely don't think we live in the utopian society. I think that's fairly obvious. But but to look at our modern society and even our predicted future society and say anything but savage, that's why I'm saying, is there a middle ground? Because I don't really think there is structurally. I think we just are savages, in a sense. we're not savages in this black and white sense that the books gives. There is sort of gray areas in between that. But I don't think we really have maybe I give an example will help.
Please.
So we live in our modern society. We have sort of moral integrity that we follow within our society, especially in this sort of Western environment. But yet we have mobile phones. Those mobile phones are essentially, and I'm going to be a bit risque here and say, they're essentially made by epsilons. And I don't mean that to dehumanize the people that are making those phones, but they are making them under the conditions that would be sort of slavery in a sense, especially at the very, very bottom layer when we're looking at mining and things like that. So in terms of, are we living in a middle ground society? I don't think so. No middle ground society could realistically allow that to exist. It would have to find, but to not allow that to exist deconstructs our society as it is. So,
well, I would say, so this depends on what you focus on. I would say that is not the part. For me, the existence of epsilons, and that is in the beginning when you said, well, nowadays people would argue that the epsilons in the book would be replaced by robots.
Sure.
It's like the existence of epsilons is not discussable as far as I understand, as far as my philosophy goes.
Sure.
And this is not to diminish anybody, but there is always someone at the bottom of a social hierarchy.
Of course.
And if that social hierarchy is elevated to the most godlike state in which even the epsilons, even the people that are very low down, have access to smartphones and, like a lot of different things, or to soma, as in the book, even the epsilon gets a big load of soma at the end of the day. Yeah. Still epsilons.
That's why I think it's only possible for the utopia because of the soma. I don't think it's actually the structure. I think it's the drug itself. And it's simply because of that. Somebody has to be at the bottom. If everybody got suddenly $1 billion or £1 billion, for example, society would crumble almost immediately. Who's going to go to work? Who's going to do different jobs? I mean, we'd all suddenly become free thinkers and philosophers sitting in our bedrooms, philosophizing and becoming depressed, probably.
Not being able to do anything useful anymore.
I mean, just look at the pandemic, of course, everyone locked in their bedrooms, how sort of socially disrupting that kind of situation is.
I would just like to finish, just to be clear. For me, in savagery, epsilons exist as well.
I agree, absolutely.
So they are not the middle ground. They are not the thing to discuss. What is to be discussed is a society that is guided by a mystic, unreflected, unconscious rule, such as the savages that just live in the day and enact their mystic dramas and dances, and the other society in which that mysticism in the form of the little capsules of soma, which is basically peyote, he basically outlines it's a psychedelic drug.
Or it's opium of some sort,
also has its place, but it's being used very controlled. So the unconscious has a little place in a little chamber where it's controlled by the conscious effort. And I think we're living in a society of middle grounds. You have the possibility for a mystic experience of the world, and you have the possibility for an unreflected interaction with your environment, but you also have the possibility to structure yourself, condition yourself.
It's very interesting.
And work in this automated, hyper-conscious, totalitarian, conditioned framework.
So it often comes down to, obviously when you dichotomize things, it's very challenging because you can't just raise one structure up against the other and say it's black and white. So I agree with you, there is middle ground in that sense, but where I'd backtrack a little bit is I don't think we have as much middle ground as we would like. I think we are still shuttled, as you were, into our little cages, into our positions. And when I say savages, I don't mean that in necessarily the most derogatory sense. I just mean that in terms of a concept.
Yeah.
That we're savage of concept rather than savage of potential.
Yeah.
I think we definitely have the potential to, to rise to great heights or to fall to great lows, either or. But I don't think we ever realize that because savage of concept. We are shuttled into an environment that in many ways reduces us, reduces our potential.
So the environment in Brave New World reduces the potential of the people in it.
Completely.
It gives, this world conditions people when they're born, it gives them a certain way of how to interact with their environment, and that's that. And if you deviate from it, you're in trouble.
Yeah,
we can get to in what kind of trouble you are later, but you're in trouble. So that is a deterministic society. Of course, even in our society, the social structure is limiting. There's a lot of influences that put you into a place. And there is this whole consumerism of content, of videos.
I mean, even going on the internet, you barely know what's real anymore. So.
Exactly. That definitely plays a similar role, but you still have the potential opportunity to transcend that.
Yes.
You can live your own life and do your own things within a social framework.
I think that's the essential human design, is this idea of potential. So that raises a really important question.
Yes.
Can a Brave New World truly exist?
Mm-hmm.
Would it eventually fall?
For how long precisely?
So that's an interesting question.
So this is a very deep question as well, I think.
I will scaffold it by saying I don't think it can possibly exist without the drug soma, because I think that's necessary to dumb the people, in a sense. Dumb not in a sense of being stupefied, but dumbed in a sense that their senses itself are limited to expression. Mm-hmm. Obviously, other books have built up on this quite. Fahrenheit, for example, builds up on this idea. Have you not read that one yet? Okay, that's a great one. We can follow up on that at some point. Books are banned, and you're not allowed to experience emotions and things like that. For Brave New World, at some point, human potential surely has to rise to the top.
Yeah.
I don't believe John Savage is a good representation of that human potential. I believe he is a voice of criticism itself that may help people break out and but the people don't want to break out. I think it was the epsilons within the book when they don't have access to soma, they basically riot. And Linda is a fantastic example of somebody who's been indoctrinated.
Yeah.
She is so indoctrinated that even living in a free environment is hell for her, basically. And then to re-enter, if we almost think about this in Plato's cave in many ways, to suddenly have this enlightenment and then to re-enter into the lowest, as John Savage would consider it, the lower echelon, it's too much. And she goes on this extended holiday and essentially commits suicide, rarely, via soma. So can a system like this, like the world that he has built here, can it actually exist? And for how long could it do before the humanity rises to the top?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Like, I'm an optimist at heart. That's why I would say I don't think it can. I think generally that totalitarian states can't exist over the long run, but there is the problem that there is, unfortunately in our lifetime, let's look at North Korea, for example, there is states that are able to suppress the human potential in such a way that it can't arise. And then it depends on what time frame are we looking at that. Yeah. I think in the last analysis, human potential has to roam free and has to be able to express itself. It's like that's how would you say, the stream of life, like the purpose, as he outlines in the book.
The why.
The why.
It's the most important question you could ask.
And here, this acid abusing Aldous Huxley,
Yes.
sort of finds this brilliant answer, which is that is what humans want. We want the struggle, and we want to grow out of the struggle, like a flower grows out of the earth. And it's like, I think that is.
We want to rise to the challenge. We
Yes.
want purpose.
Yes.
Purpose must be there, otherwise, in many ways, we deconstruct ourselves.
And so this is something I thought about as well. It's like, let's take the parts of the Brave New World that actually translate to our current society. You know, that consumerism is quite a thing.
Oh, I think he nailed it, by the way, in many ways.
This is a prophetic book.
Absolutely. There's so much built today that's useless.
Yeah.
It only exists to be consumed.
No, but let's take social media, because I love social media, as you know. Let's take social media. Social media, so if you look at Instagram, look at Instagram or look at TikTok. I don't know anything about TikTok, but it was Instagram.
As well, yeah.
You basically have 5 to 10 second clips that capture your attention span for a very short period of time. They don't have a lot of content. They can't tell you a lot. They're not able to help you in any practical way. And you keep on scrolling and watching them. But if you do that for long enough,
it's
people
addictive.
get depressed.
Yeah, but it's because it's so addictive. I mean,
but people, the humanity inside somebody knows that this is not how to spend your time, even though it's so addictive.
Agree.
Like, there's a part of the soul that rebels against it, so to speak.
It's the idea that surely I should be improving myself somehow. Am I actually improving myself in any real tangible sense by scrolling through pages and pages of YouTube Shorts?
Yeah.
Great time killer, don't get me wrong.
Yeah,
That's
no,
very
it's
useful.
awesome.
But yeah.
You know what? This might be a good short.
Yeah, it would be actually. This would be irony unto itself, but anyway.
No, it definitely. Like, what do you think about that? I think he nailed that. I have no idea how he did that, but
it's very prophetic in many ways, and I would like to sort of raise the question: are we existing in this? In a way, we've already kind of established this isn't a fully totalitarian state we're living in any sense.
No.
But in many ways, it has so much of the underlining current of a system like that. This idea of consumerism, the idea that every single individual is almost a lab rat for consumers. The moment we stop consuming, well, the structure falls apart in many ways. So many jobs are just built on this idea of consumption. Because we live in this structure that's built in that way, to some extent there has to be, whether it's, I'll be careful here, but whether it's necessarily implemented at an absolute level or whether it's sort of in the background unconsciously, I do believe there is the totalitarian essence driven into the society itself. Because there's too much subversion of free thought in many ways. Sort of thinking like going through social media, you have an explosion of free thought in many ways, but it starts to become subverted the more you use it.
Yeah, I mean...
so I think that's a problem.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think you're right in the how would you say, in recognition of the problem.
Yeah.
I don't think the diagnosis is correct.
Okay.
So I don't think it's totalitarianism that creeps in with this consumer and automatization. I would say that it's a corruption that is inherent with any human endeavor that needs to be checked.
I would agree. I would necessarily say it manifests more as a totalitarian because somebody has to control it. There has to, whether it's an individual that's controlling it or whether it's a subconscious control in a sense. For example, we may not even know that we are being controlled or that we are controllers. We might be both, for example. It's when people think of this, they always think of conspiracy theory. It's at the top end. I'd bring it right down to the bottom.
Yeah.
Say we are both the controller and the controlled, depending on context and situation.
Yes, yeah. That's why I would be careful with the totalitarian notion.
So I'm only meaning that in a conceptual sense, not in the we have a system of totalitarianism. I don't believe that's the case, but conceptually, I think we entertain those ideas whether we want to or not.
Yes. Yeah, I think you're making a valid point. I think that any human endeavor, any human change, and any human progress has the potential to be either good and is good. I mean, social media, as an example, has an enormous amount of good things about it.
It's got so much benefit it can prevent.
So much benefits, but it also has this inherent potential for exploitation, for less beneficial things. And
corruption of ideas as well, to a great extent.
Corruption ideas is a big thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's what one of the main themes of the book.
But I was amazed with reading that, and I think it was a very good recommendation of you actually to tackle it.
It is a classic, and it's a classic for many good reasons. I think it's also a good stepping stone to sort of think about the way our society is structured, and sort of think towards the future about how do we build a better society? To what extent, in going to build this better society, do we have to silence voices? And I think that's a really dangerous idea.
The censor, right. And that is actually something that we could talk about if you want.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, censorship is it's one of the main themes. So in terms of, is it right to censor? Mm-hmm. Should we censor? Because the book, I think, makes a pretty good case. Whether you think it is sincere or true or real happiness, they are experiencing happiness on a level. And that is at the result of complete and utter censorship. So...
the minority, which is outside of the social standard, is being radically suppressed and nearly silenced, moved to immovability. But that gives the majority, the people that make up the social structure in the book, a state of complete equilibrium.
Do you think we should have free voice? Complete and unparalleled. Do you want to explain your position on that?
So there is a notion that I really, really like from basically from biology, although its origin may lie in cybernetic theory. So cybernetic theory, the way how things, how, for example, a thermometer works as a system, how it adapts to the environment and all that. And there is this big notion of randomness in autopoietic systems in biology, which is that any living organism has to have a little bit of randomness and a little bit of variability on some level that deviates from the standard path, otherwise it dies. So I would actually like to give you an example which I've seen
please do,
from somebody on YouTube. So imagine you have an ant colony, right? So I don't know, if you look at an ant colony and they have like these ant streets, and all of the ants run into the same direction. So there's a big stream of ants, they run into the same direction, back and forth, from a source of food most of the times. So they have this ant street. And then every once in a while you see a single ant venturing out from that stream. And you think, that poor ant, it's lost, it doesn't know what it's doing. It actually isn't lost. What it's doing is it's randomly exploring the environment for an alternative food source. Because if the first food source comes obsolete and all of the ants run on the street, the ant colony will die. And so you need the adaptability, and that adaptability are those voices in society that speak out of the prevalent discourse.
You can make the same case for evolutionary theory, of course.
Yes.
Sort of the idea of mutation as being completely necessary.
Random mutation, even though that notion is challenged at the moment, but...
of course. But
what do you think about this autopoietic?
I mean, I love it in terms of the concept. I've always had a sort of a pet struggle with randomness because I'm fundamentally a causalist. So as we've always discussed sort of outside of this, but in a sense, I think it holds it's random only on first sight.
Yes.
When you start to go deeper into the analysis, it becomes less clear that it's actually random.
Yes, no, absolutely.
So that's where I would just only have a minor issue with the idea of randomness. But I do agree, this idea of anomaly, in a sense, is absolutely necessary.
It's a better word.
And again, a matrix is great for this because I mentioned Slavoj Zizek with The Matrix. Neo within The Matrix, I know we're going a little bit off tangent, but is a necessary anomaly for that structure to exist. Without the anomaly, the structure will collapse.
Yes.
And it definitely plays on that quite well.
Yes.
I would argue in many ways the savages in the utopian world of Huxley is the anomaly, is the necessary anomaly.
Yeah, in some sort, although I would say it's structurally differentiated from the social system.
I agree.
And I would say there is no real anomaly in the social system in the Brave New World.
But within the I guess you could say the inhabitants of the Brave New World,
yes,
they would look upon, and they do look upon,
yeah,
John Savage as the anomaly. They look upon who not to be. It's a mild interest sideshow to reinforce, in many ways, their own status,
yes,
their own symbol, their own existence in many ways. So it's reaffirming them. The anomaly is reaffirming their existence. So in that sense, it's necessary.
I've had a thought for quite a while, and I would like you to know, it's a little bit off topic.
That's fine.
But I would like to know what you think about this. So I agree with you that it's not randomness, and that anomaly is the way better term to express it, or variation.
Variation. We don't understand it.
We don't understand why the end goes a certain way or how it does, but that doesn't mean that it's random. So I think it is a big scientific notion that randomness is just lack of explanation.
Yeah, absolutely.
So just don't know what's going on, so we say it's random. But apart from that, there is this literature on the hero mythology. So Joseph Campbell, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. So this old story, which is basically presented in every big movie or book that one has ever read, which is a hero going out into the unknown, finding something that he needs, facing a big challenge, overcoming the challenge, having what he needs, and then reintegrating it into the place where he came from, which is basically the story of humanity. Joseph Campbell, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. Awesome book.
Should probably pick that up at some point.
We should.
Yeah.
Definitely. But I think that story is fundamentally the narrative of variation. It is the narrative of the ant that wanders astray and finds the food to feed the colony for the future. And I think it's the mythological representation of a very deep reality, that of autopoietic and self-referential systems itself, in which human beings and the rest of the cosmos exist. So this is a really big one, but I've linked those ideas like a year ago together. What do you think about that?
I don't actually agree with you in many ways, because if we even look at sort of religion, sort of enlightenment ideas and things like that occur within religion, it's anomalous because well, they would actually argue that our system is the anomaly and their system is the norm.
Yep.
But the hero journey within it is to come out of that system always to something different, to a recognition, to a realization. I think in many ways that's what's lacking here for the people of this utopia. They don't have that. There is no journey.
And so that's why I love the notion of the purpose being amalgamation of consciousness. I love that notion, and the contrast to happiness.
So how essential is death? Well, because death in this sense, if we obviously within a religious idea, specifically mysticism, because this is where Huxley later goes in life, the idea of transcending death becomes extremely important.
Yes.
But within the book itself, death is something that is looked upon joyfully.
Yes.
And in many ways, this is an awkward deconstruction of an atheistic, a very rigid atheistic perspective, I would say. This idea that it's just this life and there's nothing beyond. So therefore you have to make your purpose for this life, which is essential. But so you can have a hero's journey in that way.
Yeah.
They don't, I would argue they don't have that in this book.
They have happiness.
They have happiness as the end goal. The utilitarian idea, well, it's not really even, it's just for clarification, this is not high utilitarian. This is a very subverted utilitarian perspective. But
no, they and when they fly over the graveyard, it's like, oh, they did their purpose to the social body. Now they can disperse.
But even within a rigid atheistic system, death is recognized. Your own mortality is recognized. It's recognized in the way that you need to make your purpose as purposeful and as authentic as possible in your existence. Obviously, in a religious sense, the idea that death has far more reaching consequence, both morally speaking, but also to your existence that goes beyond sort of the physical, materialistic realm, if you like. So in a sense, your hero's journey becomes that much more important to you.
Yes.
It's not, and in very odd ways, that sometimes gets subverted. Because it's like, oh, this is unimportant, the material. It's only what comes after is suddenly important. So you have this very odd relationship going on, where in many ways, the atheistic perspective is often better for living a more conducive, better human life. Because if all you're thinking of is, oh, the new world, you're going to be less inclined to sort of take on that hero journey within this this material plane. But there's this, I would say, this war happening in many ways between the two thought strands. I mean, we're going way off topic in terms of that, in a sense, we were to go in that direction. But yeah, I don't know. I won't elaborate further.
No, but it's something we should definitely talk about in the future, because it fits very nicely with philosophy, literature, and science.
Yeah,
anyways,
absolutely.
All right. Any concluding remarks, or do you have a topic that we definitely need to go into?
My own concluding remark would be to sort of reinforce the oxymoron. A Brave New World is a utopian dystopia. I believe that is essentially what it is. I think it is also a nice critique of the potential danger of having too much reliance on external forces, and forces in this sense, soma being the external reliance here, to create your ontological identity. You need to, in a sense, have that individuality right to the top. You need to have that purpose, your purpose, not somebody else's purpose that's been imposed on you. It must be your purpose. And in essentially to sort of reintroduce what you were saying, the hero journey, I think so important. So that would be my concluding statement. It's a fantastic book to make you think and to make you construct and reconstruct and deconstruct the theme that is represented in the book, and try and sort of represent your own way of thinking about it. Sort of go, what does this book mean to me? Do I think of this world as a dystopia? Do I think of myself as indoctrinated? Can I break myself out of that if I do?
Yeah, fantastic. The only thing I would add is that, as with a lot of pieces of great literature, there's always the potential. And you can always translate it to your life. And unfortunately, we always have a societal structure that has characteristics of that book.
I would agree completely.
And that's why he nailed it. Yeah. He nailed an archetype.
He's a prophet in many ways, I would say. So
credit to Mr. Huxley.
Everyone, if you haven't read it, do read it. It's a classic and it's well worth your time.
Definitely.
And I think that's us.
Yeah. Apart from that, I hope you found it useful. It was a good conversation. Leave any thoughts in the comments.
Thank you very much.
And this is going to be the first video of this series, because Frankenstein is not working.
It was a disaster, but at least this one seems to have gone okay. We'll see now. Okay. Do we have a book for next time, by the way?
Do we?
I don't think we discussed one yet.
So I would have one, if you're interested.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's.
Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning.
I haven't read it, so this would be great.
So I have read it, but I will reread it.
Absolutely.
And it's 160 pages, so we could do it till next week if you want.
Yeah, I can manage that.
That's going to
it's going to build up on
itself
this a bit.
Very nicely on the theme that I tried to outline.
I mean, the search for meaning almost attaches to a little bit of what we were going on about a minute ago. So fantastic. I'll look forward to it then.
Yeah, leave your thoughts in the comments.
Till next time.
Take care. Bye.